Okay, good afternoon everybody. My name is Gareth Haywood from Semtech Corporation here with the SDVoE Alliance. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the broadcast world in terms of standardizing AV over IP, and basically tell you why these standards are not really relevant to what we're doing in Pro AV today with SDVoE technology. So before I get into the standards and what's going on themselves, I want to compare the two different industries. The broadcast industry is very standards driven. Typically, any standard that's adopted is come through the SMPTE or ITU or even the AES if it's audio. Whereas in Pro AV, we tend to deal with a lot of different standards, some of them de facto, such as HDMI, and sometimes not strictly adhered to. In terms of the video formats, broadcast is very much focused on the formats that are transmitted over air. Things like 720p, 1080i, and moving slowly but surely towards 4K, which they call 2160p. Of course, in Pro AV, it's the Wild West. We have everything from VGA through to 8K and everything in between there. Again, in broadcast, typically audio formats are fixed around AES at 48 kilohertz sampling. Whereas in Pro AV, we have to deal with audio that's intercom quality. It might be SP-Diff from the back of a Blu-ray player, mono, stereo, and all flavors of 5.1. In terms of the environments that broadcast equipment is installed in, these are very secure environments. They're closed networks. They typically do not require content protection. Key difference here in Pro AV, we nearly always deal with HDCP content protection. And even though we have that, it's not always interoperable. In the broadcast market, installers tend to be highly trained professionals dedicated to that industry, whereas we do have expert installers in Pro AV, but there's different levels of system integrators from the very large complex through to the staging and lighting guys. And in terms of the end users, within broadcast, these tend to be experts. They're trained to use this equipment, they're trained to use the cameras and the switches. That's their job. Whereas in Pro AV, that's us. That's people who want to just put a PowerPoint up and present some information. The equipment that's typically used in broadcast by broadcasters is just for that market. It's been developed for their specific needs. Whereas the equipment we're dealing with is everything from somebody's laptop, and it's in environments such as corporate, education, medical. It's really varied. And finally, in terms of interoperability, the broadcast market is very, very focused and fixated on this. And when you connect SDI equipment together from one vendor to another, you're pretty much guaranteed interoperability. However, in Pro AV, right now we're only seeing interoperability between the same vendors. You buy a Crestron MVX system, will only work with other Crestron equipment. The other thing to note about broadcast market, it's all about workflows. They are focused on the requirements for live production over IP-based networks. They're basically defining how you would replicate the workflows that previously relied on an SDI-based architecture. So because of that, they require very high levels of reliability and redundancy. When you're doing a live production that's going live to air on TV, you likely got fully redundant systems. So you've literally got 2x the equipment that you would normally require. Again, in terms of bandwidth, the broadcast world, especially in the production arena, is not very keen on using any form of compression. So they're already looking at 100 gig to meet the needs of 4K video production, and that's 4K up to 120 frames per second in some instances. So if you want to do 4K as it's known today, for example 4K P60, then the bare minimum in broadcast is likely a 25 gigabit Ethernet network is going to be installed. As I said, without the use of compression, where they have used it, it's lots of different flavors, lots of different standards. Every manufacturer has their own preference, so again, interoperability is an issue. Because of all this, this boils down to one basic summary, that the current system cost models used in broadcast do not mirror the cost models of Pro AV. They're simply too expensive. Again, the broadcast market is very fixated on standardization, and while they've standardized partial Ethernet implementation in SMPTE as 2110, there's no definition of an API within SMPTE 2110. There's no device discovery and registration. It also relies heavily on constraints applied to other standards. So you have to reference IEEE 1588 or AS67 to know how to handle timing and audio. In order to go beyond layer 4 in the Ethernet stack, you have to go to another organization called AMWA, the Advanced Media Workflow Association. They're developing a further set of standards or recommendations under the Networked Media Open Specifications, or NMOS suite. These do define things like discovery and registration, content management API, and a network controller. However, again, as I said at the beginning, there's a strong focus on broadcast workflow definition. So this group is not busy defining ways of, okay, how do I take my infrared remote and remotely control multiple TVs over a network? Or how do I take RS-232 control to set up my projector? They're focused on how do I do a multi-camera live shoot with ultimate reliability and redundant flows. On top of all this, just to confuse this even more, and you really see this is a soup of different organizations involved, there's the Alliance for IP Media Solutions, AIMS. These are around to promote open standards based on things from people like SMPTE, the Video Surfaces Forum, the EBU, from AMWA. So these guys are basically cherry picking all the best ways of doing things that make sense for the broadcasters. So as a manufacturer, if you want to get involved here, or if you want to move into the Pro AV industry using this technology, you have to participate in multiple organizations and reference a whole suite of documents to implement a solution today. So let's compare that to SDVoE. And I'm comparing this looking at the full stack solution from SDVoE. So you can see we use pretty much standard Ethernet technology all the way up to layer 4. We then have our SDVoE session management and clock recovery, and we have a fully defined API. This API is what you interface to with your software to allow you to set up the Pro AV flows that you wish to implement, such as a video wall, multi-viewer, or just simple switching of sources to destinations. To do the same thing using SMPTE 2110 technology is only a partial solution. As you can see there, SMPTE 2110 will only get you to the transport layer. How you figure out how devices introduce themselves, how they connect, how they communicate, how they send things like IR control, RS-232, USB, how you separate your audio streams and determine where they go, is defined in a separate organization. So you can see they then have to go to AMWA, and then you have to navigate through their various specifications to figure out what makes sense for your application. So as you can see, it's not really a one-stop shop. So when someone says to you, do you support SMPTE 2110, you can't really say yes and have a full solution, because if you say yes, then you're only basically getting the video packetized and ready to be presented on the network. How you then create workflows, and especially workflows specific to Pro AV applications, is undetermined. SDVoE is clearly focused on Pro AV workflows. It's a full stack solution, as I showed. It's tailored for things like matrix switching, for KVM applications at the bottom left there, for doing video walls, multi-viewers. All this is baked into our API. All the typical commands required to do all the things necessary in a multiple different Pro AV applications are built into that API. So you can almost think of it, we've abstracted that Ethernet layer completely. The hardware layer is transparent. Okay? The other thing is we've got fully defined flows for things like RS-232, IR, and USB. So these are all the kind of signals that we're commonly using in Pro AV that have not been even considered by the broadcast industry. And finally, and a key one, is we offer native HDMI and HDCP support. This is critical in this industry, in Pro AV. Again, within the SMPTE standards, there's no concept of content protection and how that's handled, specifically HDCP. So, to summarize, the broadcast industry is moving to IP, just like we are. but it's clearly focused on live production workflows and not the requirements of the Pro AV industry. The current systems that are being deployed in broadcast are really heavily engineered for their requirements. So in the end, they result in little to no cost savings over traditional SDI-based circuit switch systems. And while you've got encapsulation standards ratified in SMPTE, so again, I come from a SMPTE background, and we'll quickly tell you, oh, but these standards are all published. Well, that's great. But what about workflows? What about discovery and registration? Much slower progress on completing that because it's not even within the SMPTE environment. So SDVoE remains years ahead with the only full stack solution, and it's uniquely developed to serve the Pro AV industry. Thank you.